In today's video, we're covering more US 50, discussing it in Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, and we're also going to see how inconsistent MoDOT is at citing its control cities. Here is where we left off in the US 50 Western video at the Colorado and Kansas border. When we get to Syracuse, which was what we were previously signed for, we meet Kansas 27, and we're now signed east for Lacken and Johnson City. Lacken is for US 50 and 400, and Johnson City is for Kansas 27. When Kansas 27 leaves us, we're now signed east solely for Lacken. Once again, this should just be Garden City here. When we meet Kansas 25 in Lacken, we're now signed east for Garden City, which is what it should have been this entire time. On the mileage sign, Deerfield is our secondary and 8 miles, and Garden City is our primary in 24. Here we meet US 83 north for Scott City, and southbound is now running concurrently with us, and we also meet business routes 50 and 83, which will take you to downtown Garden City. When we leave US 83, we're now signed east for Dodge City, which is the correct choice here. When US 400 leaves us, we're still signed east for Dodge City. Past Dodge City, we meet US 283, and we're now concurrent with it for Jetmore and Kinsley. Kinsley is for US 50, and Jetmore is for US 283. When US 283 leaves us, we have the exact same control cities as we did earlier. On the mileage sign, Kinsley is on the bottom line in 28 miles, and I also didn't mention this earlier, but this should be Hutchinson, as it is 28 times larger than Kinsley is. When US 56 leaves us, it is signed east for Larned, and we're signed east for Hutchinson. When we meet US 183, we are still signed east for Hutchinson. On the mileage sign, Hutchinson is on the bottom line in 84 miles. At an interchange with Kansas 61 and Hutchinson, we're now signed east for Newton. Here we meet I-145 signed south for Wichita, and we're now running concurrently with it for Salina and Emporia. Salina is for I-145 and Emporia is for US 50. And also, if you want to see a video on I-145, check it out in the description after you finish this one. When we leave I-145, we're now signed east for Peabody and Emporia. Peabody doesn't even break 1,000 people. Emporia is fine by itself. On the mileage sign, Peabody is on the top line in 15 miles, Florence is our secondary in 26, and Emporia is on the bottom line in 71. In Emporia, we meet I-35, and we're still signed east for Emporia because we're not in downtown Emporia yet. After we pass through Emporia, we meet I-35 again, and this time we're running concurrently with it for Kansas City. On the mileage sign, Ottawa is our secondary in 49 miles, and Kansas City is our primary in 98. When we reach the Kansas City Metro, we leave I-35 and join I-435, but we have no control cities, and the concurrency is unsigned. And this is the first time we're crossing into Missouri on this channel. We're concurrent with I-435 up until the interchange between I-49 signed south for Grandview and Joplin, along with US 71. US 71 is signed north for Kansas City, and I-470, in which we leave I-445 signed north for Des Moines, and we join I-470, and we're now signed east for Lee's Summit. When US 50 leaves I-470 signed for St. Louis, we're now signed east for Sedalia. This should be Jefferson City, as it is practically double the size of Sedalia, and Jefferson City is also the capital of Missouri. And also, by the way, this is where the inconsistencies begin. MoDOT decides to be inconsistent on the mileage sign and sign Warrensburg in 31 miles. Once again, this should just be Jefferson City. East of Warrensburg, we meet Missouri 13, and we're now correctly signed for Jefferson City. However, on the mileage sign, Jefferson City is nowhere to be seen, but Sedalia and St. Louis are on it. 1, Sedalia is fine as a secondary. 2, this is inconsistent. And 3, this seems good, but in actuality, Jefferson City should still be signed because US 50 isn't fully the fastest way to St. Louis. Here is where you would turn if you were going to St. Louis. In Sedalia, we meet US 65, and we're now signed east for Tipton in 26 miles. What on earth happened to Jefferson City or even St. Louis? And why is MoDOT being so inconsistent? Also, this should just be Jefferson City here. And on the mileage sign, it is yet again inconsistent, with Jefferson City being the secondary and St. Louis being the primary. Make Jefferson City the primary. This isn't even fully the fastest way to St. Louis. Here you would turn left onto Missouri 5 to go to St. Louis, and it isn't even signed. And also, we're signed for Tipton again in 4 miles. What? Signed Jefferson City. And of course, the mileage sign is inconsistent with Tipton now being on the 3rd line. And also, St. Louis is still signed. Make Jefferson City the primary already. It's not that hard. In Tipton, Missouri 5 leaves us after running concurrently with us, and we're now signed for California, Missouri. Do you even know how to sign Jefferson City as the primary? It's your capital, for crying out loud. Just sign it. And if you guessed this mileage sign would be inconsistent, you're correct. California is now on the 3rd line, and of course St. Louis is now back on the bottom line. At this point, I shouldn't even need to say anything anymore. And when we finally reach California, we meet Missouri 87, and we're now finally signed for Jefferson City. And on this toppled over mileage sign, which is also inconsistent, Jefferson City is now our secondary again, and St. Louis is our primary. Just wait until a little bit after Jefferson City, then you can sign St. Louis MoDOT. When we get to Jefferson City, we're now signed east for St. Louis, but it's actually faster to take US 54 up to I-70, so that should be Columbia and St. Louis, and we should be signed for Rolla, which is on US 63. When US 63 leaves us, it is signed south for Rolla, and we're now signed east for St. Louis, and now it's fine. On the mileage sign, Union is our secondary in 64 miles, and St. Louis is our primary in 113. We're now running concurrently with I-44 signed east for St. Louis in 42 miles, and also west for St. Clair, that should be Springfield and Tulsa. Here we meet I-270 signed north for Chicago and south for Memphis, and we're still with I-44 for St. Louis. Here US 50 leaves I-44 for US 61 and 67 Lindbergh Boulevard. Here we meet I-55 and nothing on the exit sign has changed. When we meet I-255, we now run concurrently with it for Illinois after US 61 and 67 left us. We're now crossing over the Mississippi River into Illinois. When we meet I-64, we leave I-255 for it, and we're now signed east for Louisville. When US 50 leaves I-64, we're now signed east for Carlisle. On the mileage sign, Trenton is our secondary in 7 miles, and Carlisle is our primary still in 24. Here we meet Illinois 127, and we're now running concurrent with it for Carlisle. In Carlisle, Illinois 127 leaves us, and we're now signed east for Salem. Also, that road that's signed for East St. Louis is the old alignment at US 50. That does not change anything at all. You still gotta sign St. Louis, IDOT. On the mileage sign, Sandoval is our secondary in 14 miles, and Salem is our primary in 24. When we meet I-57, we're still signed east for Salem despite being in the city limits. However, we're not in downtown yet. In Salem, we meet Illinois 37, and we're now signed east for Flora. This should be Olney, as it's a county seat and is also almost twice the size of Flora. On the mileage sign, Xenia is our secondary in 16 miles, and Flora is still our primary in 25. Once again, this should just be Olney. West of Flora, we meet US 45, and we're now concurrent with the sign for both Olney and Flora, which is fine. When US 45 leaves us, we're now solely signed east for Olney. On the mileage sign, Olney is still our primary in 20 miles. In Olney, we meet Illinois 130, and we're now signed for Lawrenceville. Illinois being a little provincial here, this should be Vincennes because it's almost 4 times the size of Lawrenceville. On the mileage sign, though, they make Lawrenceville the secondary, and Vincennes is now our primary in 33 miles. We're now crossing over the Wabash River into Indiana, and here we get a more to discover in Indiana state welcome sign. In Vincennes, we meet US 41 and 150, and now we're both running concurrently with us, and we're now signed for Evansville and Washington. Evansville is for US 41, and Washington is for US 50 and 150. When US 41 leaves us, we have the same exact control cities as we did earlier. On the mileage sign, Washington is our primary in 18 miles. When we meet Indiana 57, we're now signed east for Shoals. This should be Bedford because Shoals doesn't even break 1,000 people. When we meet I-69, we only have control cities for Westbound and none for Eastbound. On the mileage side, Shoals is nowhere to be seen, with Lagoti as your secondary in 11 miles, and Bedford is now our primary in 41 miles. When US 150 leaves us, it is signed east for French Lick, Paoli, and Louisville. When we reach Bedford, which unlike the one in Pennsylvania, this one should actually be signed, we're now signed east for Bedford and Cincinnati. And also, signing Cincinnati here is crazy good. But of course, on the mileage sign, Cincinnati is nowhere to be seen, and we're now signed for Seymour. Under normal circumstances, I'd be fine with this, but knowing Indiana DOT can sign Cincinnati, this should just be Cincinnati here. When we meet I-65 in Seymour, we're now signed east for North Vernon. Once again, this should just be Cincinnati. After passing through North Vernon, we're signed east for Cincinnati again. On the mileage sign this time, Cincinnati actually stays and is 72 miles away. When we meet I-275, which serves as Cincinnati's beltway, we only have control cities for Westbound and none for Eastbound. We're now crossing into Ohio, and also this is I-275, and we don't have an interchange with it here. In Cincinnati, we meet I-71 and 75 signed south for 2nd Street, and we're concurrent with I-71 northbound for Columbus, the Columbia Parkway, which is US 50, and 2 I-471. When US 50 leaves I-71, we're still signed for the Columbia Parkway and 2 I-471, but we're also now signed for 2 US 52. Here we meet I-471 signed south for Newport, and we're now only signed east for the Columbia Parkway and 2 US 52. Here we meet US 52, and also another US highway in the Cincinnati Metro is US 22, which I've also made a video on that you should check out, link in the description after this one. After that, we're now signed east for Milford in 7 miles. On the eastern side of the metro, we go under I-275 again. When we meet Ohio 450 past Milford, we're now signed east for Hillsborough in 37 miles. In Hillsborough, we meet Ohio 124, and we're now signed east for Chillicothe in 38 miles. In Chillicothe, we're now running concurrently with US 23 and 35 for Portsmouth. When US 23 leaves us, it is signed south for Portsmouth, and we're still with US 35 for Jackson and Athens. Jackson is for US 35, and Athens is for US 50. When US 35 leaves us, we have the exact same control cities as we did earlier. On the mileage side, MacArthur is our secondary in 26 miles, and Athens is still our primary in 52. In Athens, we meet US 33, signed east for Pomeroy and Richland Avenue. We're now concurrent with US 33 westbound, forming a wrong-way concurrency for Columbus and Belpre. Columbus is for US 33 and Belpre is for US 50. Also, that should be Parkersburg, not Belpre. Ohio is being a little bit provincial here. When US 33 leaves us, we have the exact same control cities as we did earlier, but Parkersburg is now also signed along with Belpre. On the mileage side, however, Parkersburg is nowhere to be seen on it, and Belpre is now our primary again in 38 miles. This should be Parkersburg, not Belpre. When Ohio 32 leaves us, we're now signed east for Parkersburg, which we should have been signed for since Athens. And since we're crossing into West Virginia, now we gotta turn around and do westbound. When we cross into Ohio, we're now signed west for Pomeroy and Athens. Pomeroy is for Ohio 7 and Athens is for US 50 and Ohio 32. When Ohio 7 leaves us for Pomeroy and Gallipolis, we're now signed west for Athens and Chillicothe. On the mileage sign, Athens is our secondary in 21 miles and Chillicothe is our primary in 83. In Athens, we meet US 33 west for East State Street and Columbus, and we're now running concurrently with US 33 eastbound, forming a wrong-way concurrency for Pomeroy and Chillicothe. Pomeroy is for US 33 and Chillicothe is for US 50 and Ohio 32. When US 33 leaves us, signed east for Pomeroy and Ravenswood, we're now signed west for Chillicothe and Cincinnati. On the mileage sign, however, though Cincinnati is nowhere to be seen, with Chillicothe being our primary in 55 miles. Cincinnati should still be signed, though, because taking Ohio 32 is the fastest way to get to Cincinnati from here. When Ohio 32 leaves us, Cincinnati is actually one of the cities that are signed along with Wellston and Jackson. And at that same interchange, we're signed for MacArthur and Chillicothe in 14 and 41 miles respectively. When we meet US 35, it is signed east for Jackson in 28 miles and Schrader Road, and we're now signed west for Chillicothe in 1 mile along with US 35 westbound. Ignore the exit sign. According to Google Earth, it's wrong, but anyways, US 23 is now joining us, so we're now signed for Columbus and Dayton. When US 50 leaves US 35 and 23, they have the same exact control cities as we did earlier, and anyways, we're now signed for Main Street and Chillicothe. On the mileage sign, we're signed for Hillsborough as our secondary in 34 miles, and Cincinnati is our primary in 86 miles. Hillsborough should be our primary here because it's actually faster to turn around to get to Cincinnati from here. After Hillsborough, we're still signed for Cincinnati in 53 miles. Here, however, I think it's fine though, but when you meet Ohio 132, you should take that to get to Cincinnati. That's the fastest way there. In Owensville, we meet Ohio 142, and here you take a left to get to Cincinnati fastest from here. When Ohio 142 leaves us, we're now signed west for Milford in 11 miles. Here we go under I-275 again without having an interchange with it. After passing Milford, we're now signed west for Cincinnati 8 miles, which is fine, but currently there's some road closures on the on-ramp, so there's another way that is faster, but taking another way to US 50 is still a viable route, only being a minute slower, but you do save 70% more gas by taking it. When we meet I-471 signed south for Newport, the airport, and 2 I-275, we're now signed west for 3rd Street and 2 I-71 and 75. Here we meet I-71 and 75 signed south for Louisville and Lexington, and I-75 north for Dayton, and we're now signed west for River Road. Right before we're about to cross into Indiana, we go under I-275 again without having an interchange with it. And here we are crossing back into Indiana after going under I-275. On the mileage sign, we only have one control city, this being Lawrenceburg in 4 miles. When we meet I-275, we're now signed west for Greendale, Lawrenceburg, and Aurora. After passing through those cities, we're now signed west for Versailles. This should be Seymour here though. On the mileage sign, they actually do this, with Versailles being our secondary in 12 miles and Seymour is now our primary in 47. When we meet I-65, we're still signed west for Seymour, but we're now also signed for Brownstown, and also it should be Bedford, not Brownstown on the sign. In Brownstown, we meet Indiana 135, and we're now signed west for Bedford. On the mileage sign, Vincennes is shockingly now on the bottom line in 96 miles, while Bedford is a secondary in 26. After we pass through Bedford, when Indiana 37 leaves us after joining us in Bedford, we're now signed west for Shoals and Vincennes. On the mileage sign, though, Vincennes is nowhere to be seen, with Shoals being our secondary in 21 miles and Lagoti as our primary in 29. In Shoals, US 150 joins us and we're still signed west for Lagoti. In Lagoti, we meet US 231 and we're now running concurrent with it for Washington, which is for US 50 and 150. When US 231 leaves us, we're still signed west for Washington. On the mileage sign, Washington is still our primary in 14 miles. When we meet I-69, we're still signed west for Washington, but we're now also signed for Vincennes again. When we meet Indiana 57, we're now solely signed west for Vincennes. In Vincennes, we meet US 41 signed south for Evansville, and we're now concurrent with US 41 northbound for Terre Haute and Lawrenceville. Terre Haute is for US 41 and 150, and Lawrenceville is for US 50. When US 41 and 150 leave us, we're still signed west for Lawrenceville. On the mileage sign, though, Lawrenceville is now our secondary in 10 miles, and shockingly, St. Louis is now our primary in 152 miles. Now let's see if IDOT keeps this signage going or not. We're now crossing back over the Wabash River into Illinois. Illinois needs to fix this O on this state welcome sign, but at least it's still visible. And if you guessed IDOT wouldn't keep up St. Louis signage, you're correct. We're now signed west for Olney. If Indiana can sign St. Louis, so can Illinois, so this should just be St. Louis here. On the mileage sign, we have Olney on it in 20 miles. Once again, this should just be St. Louis here. When we meet Illinois 130 in Olney, we're now signed west for Flora, just signed St. Louis here again. On the mileage sign, though, Flora becomes a secondary and Salem is now our primary in 40 miles. This should still be St. Louis, though. In Salem, we meet Illinois 37 and we're now signed west for Sandoval. Illinois, can you stop being provincial, please, and just sign St. Louis already? When we meet I-57, we're still signed west for Sandoval. This should just be St. Louis. On the mileage sign, Odin is our secondary in 4 miles and Sandoval is still our primary in 8. Illinois, I give up with you at this point. In Sandoval, we meet US 51 north for Vandalia and we're now running concurrently with it for Carlisle and Centralia. Carlisle is for US 50 and Centralia is for US 51. Also, I have 2 US 51 videos. You should check out the link in the description after this one. When US 51 leaves us, we have the exact same control cities as we did earlier. Also, signed St. Louis here, Illinois. After literally forever, IDOT finally signed St. Louis after Indiana signing it 92 miles away. Here we have a picture from the Derpog of US 50 meeting Illinois 4 in Lebanon. Here we meet I-64 east for Mount Vernon. That should be Evansville and Louisville. We're now running concurrent with it west for East St. Louis IDOT. How can you sign St. Louis on a US highway but not on an interstate? This should be St. Louis. Stop signing secondaries at random interchanges. When we meet I-255, US 50 leaves I-64 and we're now signed for Memphis. Not long after, we cross back over the Mississippi River back into Missouri. When we meet US 61 and 67, we leave I-255 and we're now signed for Lindbergh Boulevard and LeMay Ferry Road. When we meet I-55, we're now only signed for Lindbergh Boulevard. When we meet I-44, US 50 leaves US 61 and 67 Ford, and we have no control cities. Here we meet I-270 signed for Memphis and Chicago. When US 50 leaves I-44, we're now signed west for Union and Jefferson City. On the mileage sign, though, Kansas City is now our primary in 217 miles. 1, taking US 50 isn't the fastest way to get to Kansas City from here. 2, this is inconsistent. And 3, keep Jefferson City as the primary until you get there. When we meet US 63 east of Jefferson City, we're now signed for Jefferson City along with US 63. When we meet US 54, we're now signed west for Sedalia, which is actually correct because it's faster to take US 63 up to I-70 to get to Kansas City. On the mileage sign, Tipton is on the third line in 11 miles. Sedalia is now our secondary in 36 and Kansas City is now our primary in 112. I think it should still be Sedalia though because US 50 isn't fully the fastest way to Kansas City yet. In Tipton, we meet Missouri 5 and we're now running concurrent with it for Syracuse. This should be Sedalia and Kansas City, not Syracuse. When Missouri 5 leaves us, it isn't even signed for Kansas City and we're still signed west for Syracuse. That should be Sedalia, not Syracuse. In Syracuse, we're now signed west for Smithton. Sign Sedalia already, MoDOT. It's not that hard. And of course, on the mileage sign, Smithton is now on the third line in 12 miles and Kansas City is our primary again. As I said earlier, keep Sedalia as the primary. Here you turn left to go to Smithton and we're now signed for Sedalia in 7 miles. On the mileage sign, Sedalia is of course on the third line now in 7 miles and Kansas City is yet again our primary. This should still be Sedalia though. If you were looking to go to Kansas City, you turn right here to stay on the fastest way. In Sedalia, we meet US 65 and we're now signed west for Lamontie. This should be Warrensburg here. In Lamontie, we're now signed west for Knob Noster in 7 miles, but now US 50 is the fastest way to get to Kansas City, so this should be Kansas City. In Knob Noster, we meet Missouri 23 and we're now signed west for Warrensburg, signed Kansas City here. Thankfully, on the mileage sign, Kansas City is put on the bottom line in 55 miles. When we meet Missouri 13, we're now signed west for Lee Summit. MoDOT, how can you sign a suburb of Kansas City, but not Kansas City itself? I'm done with you at this point. However, though, on the mileage sign, Kansas City is thankfully our primary in 48 miles, while Lee Summit is the secondary in 39. When we meet I-470, we're now running concurrent with it signed west for Wichita. When I-470 ends, we meet I-49 and US 71 signed south for Joplin, and US 71 is signed north for Kansas City, and I-435 north for Des Moines, and we're now running concurrent with it west for Wichita. And when we cross back into Kansas, we don't get a Kansas State welcome sign, so this is the best thing we get for a state welcome sign. When we meet I-35, we're now joining it signed for Wichita, and we only see these signs on the side saying US 50, 56, and 169 are also following this route. When US 169 leaves us, it is signed south for Paola, and when US 56 leaves us, it is signed west for Gardner. When US 50 leaves I-35, we're now signed for 6th Avenue. This isn't good. This should be Emporia, not 6th Avenue. When we meet I-35 again, we're now signed west for Newton. On the mileage sign, Strong City is on the third line in 16 miles. Florence is our secondary in 42, and Newton is still our primary in 69. When we reach Newton, we join I-135 southbound with no choice to go on northbound. When we leave I-135 signed south for Wichita, we're now signed west for Hutchinson. On the mileage sign, we can see that Hutchinson is 27 miles away. Here we meet Kansas 61, and we're now running concurrent with it for Pratt and Kinsley. Pratt is for Kansas 61, and Kinsley is for US 50. Also, it should be Dodge City, not Kinsley. When Kansas 61 leaves us, we have the exact same control seats as we did earlier. Also, once again, this should just be Dodge City here. On the mileage sign, Kinsley is still signed in 76 miles. This should be Dodge City. In Kinsley, we meet US 183, and we're now finally signed west for Dodge City. When we meet US 56 again, we're still signed west for Dodge City along with it. On the mileage sign, Spearville is our secondary in 18 miles, and Dodge City is our primary still in 33. When we meet US 283, we're still signed west for Dodge City along with it, and US 56 still. When US 56 and 283 leave us, they're signed for Mineola and Sublette. That should be Dodge City because it's a faster way to get to downtown coming from this direction, and we're now signed for Cimarron. That should be Garden City, not Cimarron. When US 400 joins us, we're still signed west for Cimarron. This should just be Garden City here again. In Cimarron, we meet Kansas 23, and we're now correctly signed west for Garden City. On the mileage sign, we're still signed for Garden City in 33 miles. When we meet US 83, we're now running concurrently with it for Scott City and Lakin. Scott City is for US 83, and Lakin is for US 50 and 400. When US 83 leaves us, we're now solely signed west for Lakin. This should be Pueblo. And even on the mileage sign, Lakin is still signed. This should just be Pueblo, not gonna lie. In Lakin, we meet Kansas 25, and we're now signed west for Syracuse. That should just be Pueblo. On the mileage sign, though, we're now signed for Holly, which is in Colorado, but it's even worse than Syracuse. This should still be Pueblo, though, if Kansas can sign out of state. And here's where we cross back into Colorado. The control cities for Eastbound should be Garden City, skip Syracuse and Lakin, then Dodge City, Hutchinson, skip Kinsley, then Newton, Emporia, Kansas City, then Overland Park when you join I-445, then Des Moines after that, then Lee Summit when you join I-470, then Jefferson City, skip Sedalia, Warrensburg, Tipton, and California, then Rolla, then St. Louis when US 63 leaves us, then Lindbergh Boulevard when you leave I-44, then Illinois when you join I-255, then Louisville when you join I-64, then Salem when you leave I-64, then Olney, skip Florida, then Vincennes, skip Lawrenceville, then Washington, Bedford, Cincinnati, skip Seymour, North Vernon, then Hillsborough, Chillicothe, Athens, and Parkersburg, skip Belpre. And for Westbound, it should be Athens, Chillicothe, Hillsborough, Cincinnati, all of these before Cincinnati because taking US 50 isn't fully the fastest way to get there. Then Milford when you meet Ohio 132, then Cincinnati again, then 3rd Street, River Road, Lawrenceburg, Seymour, Bedford, skip Brownstown, Washington, skip over Lagos, then Vincennes, St. Louis, skip over Lawrenceville, Olney, Flora, Salem, Sandoval, and Carlisle, then Memphis when you leave I-64, then Lindbergh Boulevard when you leave I-255, then Tulsa and Springfield when you join I-44, then Jefferson City when you leave I-44, then Sedalia, skip over Syracuse, Smithton, and Lamontie, then Kansas City when you get to Lamontie, skip Knob, Noster, Warrensburg, and Lee Summit, then Wichita when you join I-470, continue to sign when you join I-435 and I-35, then Emporia when you leave I-35, then Newton, Hutchinson, Dodge City, skip Kinsley, Garden City, skip Cimarron and Pueblo, skip Lakin, Syracuse, and Holly. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to check out US 50 Western where I cover this highway from California to the beginning of this video, and also please subscribe. I also have others on my channel where I cover more US highways, and I also cover interstates and state highways, and I also look into control cities and see if they're worthy of control city sets. Anyways, see you guys next time. Bye!